All right, guys, so on to the final two chapters. In this video, I'm going to read chapters 16 and 17 together. Since on your agenda, it's scheduled that you guys are going to be listening to both of them today. All right, so in the last chapter, we know that Alex was able to get onto the plane. We found out that Mr. Grin was flying it, and he said, "You need to take me to the Science Museum," okay? So now chapter 16, if you're using one of the black books, it's on page 172, and it is called 12 o'clock. So we're only 1 hour before the ceremony's supposed to start. So don't worry about writing down on your evidence logs for this chapter since we've already done our body paragraphs. All right, so chapters 16 and 17, we're going to read them both, okay? So, chapter 16, 12 o'clock. London appeared. Suddenly the clouds rolled back and the late morning sun brought the whole city shining into view. There was Battersea Power Station, standing proud with its 4 great chimneys still intact, even though much of its roof had long ago been eaten away. Behind it, Battersea Park appeared as a square of dense green bushes and trees that were making a last stand, fighting back the urban spread. In the far distance, the Millennium Wheel perched like a fabulous silver coin, balancing effortlessly on its rim. And all around it, London crouched. Gas towers and apartment blocks, endless rows of shops and houses, roads, railways, and bridges stretching away on both sides, separated only by the bright silver crack in the landscape that was the River Thames. Alex saw all of this with a clenched stomach, looking out through the open door of the aircraft. He'd had 50 minutes to think about what he had to do. 50 minutes while the plane droned over Cornwall and Devon, then Somerset and the Salisbury Plains before reaching the North Downs and on towards Windsor and London. When he had got into the plane, he had intended to use the radio to call the police or anyone else who might be listening. But seeing Mr. Grin at the controls had changed all that. He remembered how fast the man had been when he encountered him outside the bedroom. He knew he was safe enough in the cargo area with Mr. Grin strapped into the pilot's seat at the front of the plane. But he didn't dare get any closer. Even with the gun, it would be too dangerous. He had thought of forcing Mr. Grin to land the plane at Heathrow. The radio had started squawking the moment they entered London airspace and had only stopped when Mr. Grin turned it off. But that would have never have worked. By the time they reached the airport, touched down, and coasted to a halt, it would be far too late. And then, sitting, hunched up in the cargo area, Alex had realized the 2 bundles lying on the floor next to him. They had told him exactly what he had to do. "Rrr," Mr. Grin said. He twisted around in his seat, and for the last time Alex saw the hideous smile that the circus knife had thrown through his cheeks. "Thanks for the ride," Alex said, and jumped out of the open door. The bundles were parachutes. Alex had checked them out and strapped one onto his back when they were still over Reading. He was glad that he'd spent a day on parachute training with the SAS, although this flight had been even worse than the one he'd endured over the Welsh Valleys. Because remember, he didn't actually jump onto the plane last time, but he still got the training for it. This time there was no static line. There had been no one to reassure him that his parachute was properly packed. If he could have thought of any other way to reach the Science Museum in the 7 minutes that he had left, he would have taken it. There was no other way. He knew that, so he had jumped. Once he was over the threshold, it wasn't too bad. There was a moment of dizzying confusion as the wind hit him once again. He closed his eyes and forced himself to count to 3. Pulled too early and the parachute might snag on the plane's tail. Even so, his hand was clenched, and he had barely reached 3 before he was pulling with all of his strength. The parachute blossom opened above him, and he was jerked back upward, the harness cutting into his armpits and sides. They had been flying at 10,000 feet. When Alex opened his eyes, he was surprised by his sense of calm. He was dangling in the air, underneath a comforting canopy of white silk. He felt as if he wasn't moving at all. Now that he had left the plane, the city seemed even more distant and unreal. It was just him, the sky, and London. He was almost enjoying himself. And then he heard the plane coming back. It was already a mile or more away, but now he saw it bank steeply to the right, making a sharp turn. The engines rose, the plane leveled out, and it headed straight toward him. Mr. Grin wasn't going to let him get away so easily. As the plane grew closer, he could imagine the man's never-ending smile behind the window of the cockpit. Mr. Grin intended to steer the plane straight into him and cut him to shreds in midair. So if you can imagine that, here's Alex up in the air, right, with his parachute. Mr. Grin turns the plane around and he's headed right for him. However, says, but Alex had been expecting it. He reached down and took the Game Boy out of his trouser pocket. This time, there was no game cartridge in it, but he had slipped Bomber Boy out a long time ago and slid it across the floor of the empty cargo plane. That was where it was now, just behind Mr. Grin's seat. A smoke bomb set off by the remote control. He pressed the start button 3 times. Inside the plane, the cartridge exploded, releasing a cloud of acrid yellow smoke. The smoke billowed out and through the hold, curling against the windows, trailing out of the open door. Mr. Grin vanished, completely surrounded by smoke. The plane wobbled, then plunged down. Alex watched the plane dive. He could imagine Mr. Grin blinded, fighting for control. The plane began to twist slowly at first, then faster and faster. The engines whined. Now it was heading straight for the ground, howling through the sky. Yellow smoke trailed out of its wake. At the last minute, Mr. Grin managed to bring up the nose again, but it was much too late. The plane smashed into what looked like a deserted piece of dock near the River Thames and disappeared in a ball of flame. Alex looked at his watch. 3 minutes to 12. He was still thousands of feet in the air, and unless he landed on the very doorstep of the Science Museum, he wasn't going to make it. Grabbing a hold of the ropes, using them to steer himself, he tried to work out the fastest way down. So that's a lot going on there. So Alex jumped out. Mr. Grin tried to get him. Alex used Bomber Boy, and Mr. Grin was donezo. So now Alex is still floating in the air, still a few thousand feet up, and he's going to have to try to steer himself to get himself to the Science Museum somehow. All right, it says, inside the East Hall of the Science Museum, Herod Sale was coming to the end of his speech. The entire chamber had been transformed for the great moment when the Stormbreakers would be brought online. The room was caught between old and new, between stone colonnades and stainless steel floors, between the very latest in high-tech and old curiosities from the Industrial Revolution. A podium had been set up in the center for Sale, the Prime Minister, his press secretary, and the Minister of the State for Education. In front of them were 12 rows of chairs for journalists, teachers, invited friends. Alan Blunt was in the front row, as emotionless as ever. Mrs. Jones, dressed in black with a large brooch over her lapel. So it's just like a pin and this is like a lapel, just kind of a little fold, and probably her dress shirt. She was sitting next to him. On either side, television towers had been constructed with cameras focusing in as Sale spoke. The speech was being broadcasted live to schools throughout the country, and it would also be shown on the evening news. The hall was packed with another 200 or 300 people, standing on first and second floor galleries, looking down on the podium from all sides. As Sale spoke, tape recorders turned and light bulbs flashed. Never before had a private individual made so generous a gift to the nation. This was an event, history in the making. It is the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister alone who is responsible for what is about to happen, Sale was saying. And I hope that tonight, when he reflects on what has happened today throughout this country, that he will remember our days together at school and everything he did at that time. I think tonight the country will know him for the man he is. One thing is sure, this is a day you will never forget. He bowed. There was a scattering of applause. The Prime Minister glanced at his press secretary, puzzled. The press secretary shrugged with barely concealed rudeness. The Prime Minister took his place in front of the microphone. So it's almost as if he doesn't really remember or know how his actions really affected Herod Sale at all. I'm not quite sure how to respond to that, he joked, and all of the journalists laughed. The government had such a large majority that they knew it was in their best interest to laugh at the Prime Minister's jokes. I'm glad that Mr. Sale has such happy memories of our school days together, and I'm glad that the two of us together today can make such a vital difference to our nation's schools. Herod Sale gestured at a table slightly to one side of the podium. On the table was a Stormbreaker computer, and next to it, a mouse. This is the master control, he said. Click on the mouse, and all of the computers will come online. Right. The Prime Minister lifted his finger and adjusted his position so that the cameras could get his best profile. Somewhere outside the museum, a clock struck 12. Alex heard the clock from about 500 feet up, with the roof of the Science Museum rushing toward him. He had seen the building just after the plane had crashed. It hadn't been easy finding it, with the city spread out like a three-dimensional map right underneath him. On the other hand, he had lived his whole life in West London and had visited the museum often enough. First, he had seen the Victorian pile that was Albert Hall. Directly south of it was a tall white tower surmounted by a green dome. Imperial College. As Alex dropped, he seemed to be moving faster. The whole city had become a fantastic jigsaw puzzle, and he knew he had only seconds to piece it together. A wide, extravagant building with church-like towers and windows that had to be the Natural History Museum. The Natural History Museum was on Cromwell Road. How did you get from there to the Science Museum? Of course, turn left at the lights up Expedition Road. And there it was. Alex pulled at the parachute, guiding himself toward it. How small it looked compared to the other landmarks, a rectangular building jutting in from the main road with a flat gray roof and next to it a series of arches, the sort of thing you might see on a railway station or perhaps an enormous conservatory. There was a dull orange in color, curving one after the other. It looked as if they were made of glass. Alex could land on the flat roof. There, all he would have to do was look through the curved one. He still had the gun he had taken from the guard. He could use it to warn the Prime Minister. If he had to, he figured, he could use it to shoot Herod Sale. Somehow he managed to maneuver himself over the museum, but it was only as he fell the last 500 feet as he heard the clock strike 12 that he realized two things. He was falling much too fast, and he had missed the flat roof. Right, so we have another example of when Alex miscalculated, right? Remember towards the beginning of the book when he was trying to grab onto that flagpole. So here he is kind of using this parachute to guide him down, okay, to get on top of the Science Museum, but he's missed the flat roof. So we're going to find out what happens. In fact, the Science Museum had two roofs. The original is Georgian and made of wired glass, but sometime recently it must have leaked because the curators constructed a second roof of plastic sheeting over the top. This was the orange roof that Alex had seen. He crashed into it with both feet at about 30 miles per hour. The roof shattered. He continued straight through into an inner chamber, just missing a network of steel girders and maintenance ladders. He barely had time to register what looked like a brown carpet stretched out over the curving surface below. Then he hit it and tore through that too. So it's like as if he's going through the layers of this roof. It was no more than a thin cover designed to keep the light and dust off the glass that it covered. With a yell, Alex smashed through the glass. At last, his parachute caught on a beam. He jerked to a halt, swinging in midair inside the East Hall. So imagine that. His parachute is stuck on some beams that are going across to kind of hold the roof up, and he's just dangling there, okay? And he looks down, and this is what he saw. Far below him, all around him, 300 people had stopped and were staring up at him in shock. There were more people sitting on chairs directly underneath him, and some of them had been hit. There was blood and broken glass. A bridge made of green glass slats stretched across the hall. There was a futuristic information desk, and in front of it, at the very center of everything, was a makeshift stage. He saw the Stormbreaker first. Then, with a sense of disbelief, he recognized the Prime Minister standing, slack-jawed, next to Herod Sale. He hung in the air, dangling at the end of the parachute. As the last pieces of glass fell and disintegrated on the terracotta floor, movement and sound returned to the East Hall in an ever-widening wave. The security men were the first to react. Anonymous and invisible when they needed to be, they were suddenly everywhere, appearing from behind colonnades, from underneath the television towers, running across the green bridge, guns in hands that had been empty a second before. Alex had also drawn his own gun, pulling it out from the waistband of his trousers. Maybe he could explain why he was here before Sale or the Prime Minister activated the Stormbreakers, but he doubted it. Shoot first and ask questions later was a line from a bad film, but even bad films are sometimes right. He emptied the gun. The bullets echoed around the room, surprisingly loud. Now people were screaming, the journalists punching and pushing as they fought for cover. The first bullet smashed into the information desk. The second hit the Prime Minister in the hand, his finger less than an inch away from the mouse. The third hit the mouse, blowing it into fragments. The fourth hit an electrical connection, disintegrating the plug and short-circuiting it. Sale had dived forward, determined to click on the mouse himself. The fifth and sixth bullets hit him. As soon as Alex had fired the last bullet, he dropped the gun, letting it clatter to the floor below, and held up the palm of his hands. He felt ridiculous, hanging there from the ceiling, his arms outstretched. But there were already a dozen guns pointing at him, and he had to show them that he was no longer armed, that they didn't need to shoot. Even so, he braced himself, waiting for the security men to open fire. He could almost imagine the hail of bullets tearing into him. As far as they were concerned, it was some sort of crazy terrorist who had just parachuted into the Science Museum and taken 6 shots at the Prime Minister. It was their job to kill him. It was what they were trained for. But the bullets never came. All the security men were equipped with radio microphones, and in the front row, Mrs. Jones had control. The moment she recognized Alex, she had been speaking urgently into her brooch, so the pin that she had. "Don't shoot. Repeat, don't shoot. Await my command." On the podium, a plume of gray smoke rose out of the sides of the broken, useless Stormbreaker. 2 security men had rushed the Prime Minister, who was clutching his wrist, blood dripping out of his hand. The photographers and journalists had begun to shout questions. Their cameras were flashing, and the television cameras, too, had swung around to focus in on the figure swaying high above. More security men were moving to seal off the exits, following the orders from Mrs. Jones, while Alan Blunt looked on, and for once in his life, out of his depth. But there was no sign of Herod Sale. The head of Sale Enterprises had been shot twice, but somehow he had disappeared. All right, guys, so if you wanted to take a break real quick before we listen to Chapter 17, feel free. All right, guys, this is it. So, Chapter 17, if you're using one of the black books, it starts on page 183. So that last chapter full of action, we know that Alex did make it to the Science Museum. He had to break through the roof, and we know that he was able to use the gun to, he shot the Prime Minister in the hand on accident. He blew up the mouse. One of them hit one of the controls, and then the other 2 hit Herod Sale. So this last chapter is called Yasin. So I want you to stop, take a second, think about what you think might happen. So it says, "You slightly spoiled things by shooting the Prime Minister," Alan Blunt said. "But all in all, you're to be congratulated, Alex. You not only lived up to our expectations, you way exceeded them." It was late afternoon the following day, and Alex was sitting in Blunt's office at the Royal and General building on Liverpool Street, wondering just why, after everything he had done for them, the head of MI6 had to sound quite so much like the principal of a second-rate private school, giving him a good report. Mrs. Jones was sitting next to him. Alex had refused her offer of a peppermint, although he was beginning to realize it was all the reward he was going to get. She spoke now for the first time since he had come into the room. "You might like to know about the clearing up operation." "Sure." She glanced at Blunt, who nodded. "First of all, don't expect to read the truth about any of this in the newspapers," she began. "We put a D notice on it, which means nobody is allowed to print anything. Of course, the ceremony at the Science Museum was being televised live, but fortunately we were able to cut the transmission before the cameras could focus on you. In fact, nobody knows that it was a 14-year-old boy who caused all of the chaos." "And we plan to keep it that way," Blunt muttered. "Why?" Alex didn't like the sound of that. Mrs. Jones dismissed the question. "The newspapers had to print something, of course," she went on. "The story we put out there is that Sale was attacked by a hitherto unknown terrorist organization, and that's why he's gone into hiding." "Where is Sale?" Alex asked. "We don't know, but we'll find him. There's nowhere on earth he can hide from us." "Okay," Alex sounded doubtful. "As for the Stormbreakers, we've already announced that there is a dangerous product fault and that anyone turning them on could get electrocuted. It's embarrassing for the government, of course, but they've all been recalled and we're bringing them in now. Fortunately, Sale was so fanatical that he programmed them so that the smallpox virus could only be released by the Prime Minister at the Science Museum. You've managed to destroy the trigger, so even the few schools that have tried to start up their computers haven't been affected." "It was very close," Blunt said. "We've analyzed a couple of samples. It's lethal. Worse than the stuff Iraq was brewing up in the Gulf War." "Do you know who supplied it?" Alex asked. Blunt coughed. "No." "How about the submarine that I saw?" "Forget about the submarine." It was obvious that Blunt didn't want to talk about it. "You can just be sure we'll make all of the necessary inquiries." "What about Yasin Gregorovich?" Alex asked. Mrs. Jones took over. "We've closed down the plant at Port Talon," she said. "We've already have most of the personnel under arrest. It's unfortunate, though, that we weren't able to talk to either Nadia Vole or the man you knew as Mr. Grin. He never talked much anyway, Alex said. It was lucky that his plane crashed into a building site, Mrs. Jones went on. Nobody else was killed. As for Yasin, I imagine he'll disappear. From what you've told us, it's clear that he wasn't actually working for Sale. He was working for the people who were sponsoring Sale, and I doubt they'll be very pleased with him. Yasin is probably on the other side of the world already, but one day perhaps we'll find him. We'll never stop looking. There was a long silence. It seemed that the two spy masters had said all they wanted, but there was one question nobody had asked. What happens to me? Alex asked. You go back to school, Blunt replied. Mrs. Jones took out an envelope and handed it to Alex. A check? Alex asked. It's a letter from a doctor explaining why you've been away for 3 weeks with the flu. Or that you've been away with the flu. Very bad flu. And if anyone asks, he's a real doctor. You shouldn't have any trouble. You'll continue to live in your uncle's house, Blunt said. That housekeeper of yours, Jack whatever, we'll get her visa renewed and she'll continue to look after you. And that way we'll know where you are, if we need you again. Need you again? The words chilled Alex more than anything that had happened to him in the past 3 weeks. You've got to be kidding me, he said. No. Blunt gazed at him quite coolly. It's not my habit to make jokes. You've done very well, Alex, Mrs. Jones said, trying to sound more conciliatory. The Prime Minister himself asked us to pass on his thanks to you, and the fact of the matter is that it could be wonderfully useful to have someone as young as you, as talented as you, Blunt cut in, available to us from time to time. She held up a hand to ward off any argument. Let's not talk about it now, she said, but if ever another situation arises, maybe we can talk about it then. Yeah, sure. Alex looked from one to the other. These weren't people who were going to take no for an answer. In their own way, they were both charming as Mr. Grin. Can I go? He asked. Of course you can, Mrs. Jones said. Would you like someone to drive you home? No, thanks, Alex got up. I'll find my own way. He should have been feeling better. As he took the elevator down to the ground floor, he reflected that he'd saved thousands of school children. He'd beaten Herod Sale, and he hadn't been killed or even badly hurt. So what was there to be unhappy about? The answer was simple. Blunt had forced him into this. In the end, the big difference between him and James Bond wasn't the question of age. It was a question of loyalty. In the old days, spies had done what they'd done because they loved their country, because they believed in what they were doing. But he'd never been given a choice. Nowadays, spies weren't employed. They were used. He came out of the building, meaning to walk up to the tube station, which is just like the subway. But just then a cab drove alongside and he flagged it down. He was too tired for public transport. He glanced at the driver, huddled over the wheel in a horribly knitted homemade cardigan, and slumped into the back seat. Shane Walk, Chelsea, Alex said. The driver turned around. He was holding a gun. His face was paler than it had been the last time Alex saw it, and the pain of the 2 bullet wounds was drawn all over it. But impossibly, it was Herod Sale. If you move, you bloody child, I will shoot you, Sale said. His voice was pure venom. If you try anything, I will shoot you. Sit down. You're coming with me. The doors clicked shut, locking automatically. Herod Sale turned around and drove off down Liverpool Street, heading for the city. Alex didn't know what to do. He was certain that Sale planned to shoot him anyway. Why else would he have taken the huge chance of driving up to the very door of MI6 headquarters in London? He thought about trying the window, perhaps trying to get the attention of another car at a traffic light, but it wouldn't work. Sale would turn around and kill him. The man had nothing left to lose. They drove for 10 minutes. It was a Saturday and the city was closed. The traffic was light. Then Sale pulled up in the front of a modern glass-fronted skyscraper with an abstract statue, 2 oversized bronze walnuts on a slab of concrete outside the front door. You will get out of the car with me, Sale commanded. You and I will walk into the building. If you think about running, remember that this gun is pointing at your spine. Sale got out of the car first. His eyes never left Alex. Alex guessed that the 2 bullets must have hit him in the left arm and shoulder. His left hand was hanging limp, but the gun was in his right hand. It was perfectly steady, aimed at Alex's lower back. In. The building had swing doors and they were open. Alex found himself in a marble-clad hall with leather sofas and a curving reception desk. There was nobody here either. Sale gestured with a gun and he walked over to a bank of elevators. One of them was waiting. He got in. The 29th floor, Sale said. Alex pressed the button. Are we going up for the view? He asked. Sale nodded. You make all the bloody jokes you want, he said, but I'm going to have the last laugh. They stood in silence. Alex could feel the pressure in his ears as the elevator rose higher and higher. Sale was staring at him, his damaged arm tucked into his side, supporting himself against one wall. Alex thought about attacking him, if he could just get the element of surprise. But no, they were too close, and Sale was coiled up like a spring. The elevator slowed down and the doors opened. Sale waved with the gun. Turn left. You'll come to a door. Open it. Alex did as he was told. The door was marked helipad. A flight of concrete steps led up. Alex glanced at Sale. Sale nodded. Up. They climbed the steps and reached another door with a push bar. Alex pressed it and went through. He was back outside, 30 floors up on a flat roof with a radio mast and a tall metal fence running around the perimeter. He and Sale were standing on the edge of a huge cross painted in red paint. Looking around, he could see right across the city to the Canary Wharf and beyond. It had seemed a quiet spring day when Alex left the Royal and General office, but up here, the wind streaked past and the clouds boiled. You ruined everything, Sale howled. How did you do it? How did you trick me? I'd have beaten you if you'd been a man, but they had to send a boy, a bloody schoolboy. Well, it isn't over yet. I'm leaving England. That's why I brought you here. I wanted you to see. Sale nodded and Alex turned around to see that there was a helicopter hovering in the air behind him. Where had it come from? It was painted red and yellow, a light single-engine aircraft with a figure in dark glasses and a helmet hunched over the controls. The helicopter was a Colibri EC-120B, one of the quietest in the world. It swung around over him, its blades beating in the air. There's my ticket out of here, Sale continued. They'll never find me, and one day I'll be back. Next time, nothing will go wrong, and you won't be here to stop me. This is the end for you. This is where you die. There was nothing Alex could do. Sale raised the gun and took aim, his eyes wide, the pupils blacker than they had ever been, mere pinpricks in the bulging white. There were two small explosive cracks. Alex looked down, expecting to see blood. There was nothing. He couldn't feel anything. Then Sale staggered and fell onto his back. There were two gaping holes in his chest. The helicopter landed in the center of the cross. The pilot got out. Still holding the gun that had harried Sale, he walked over and examined the body, prodding it with his shoe. Satisfied, he nodded to himself, tucking the gun away. He had switched off the engine of the helicopter, and behind him the blade slowed down and stopped. Alex stepped forward. The man seemed to notice him for the first time. All right, so Harried Sale, he's donezo. You're Yasin Grigorovich, Alex said. The Russian nodded. It was impossible to tell what was going on in his head. His clear blue eyes gave nothing away. Why did you kill him? Alex asked. Those were my instructions. There was no trace of an accent in his voice. He spoke softly, reasonably. He had become an embarrassment. It was better this way. Not better for him, Yasin shrugged. What about me? Alex asked. The Russian ran his eyes over Alex as if weighing him up. I have no instructions concerning you, he said. You're not going to shoot me too? Do I have any need to? There was a pause. The two of them gazed at each other over the corpse of Harried Sale. You killed Ian Ryder, he said. He was my uncle. Yasin shrugged. Kill a lot of people. One day, I'll kill you. A lot of people have tried, Sale smiled. Believe me, he said. It would be better if we didn't meet again. Go back to school. Go back to your life. And the next time they ask you, say no. Killing is for grown-ups, and you're still a child. He turned his back on Alex and climbed into the cabin. The blade started up, and a few seconds later, the helicopter rose back into the air. For a moment, it hovered over the side of the building. Behind the glass, Yasin raised a hand, a gesture of friendship, a salute. Alex raised his. The helicopter spun away. Alex stood where he was, watching it until it had disappeared in the dying light. All right, so there's the end of our novel. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And just so you know, too, I know in the back of my book, there is a little excerpt of the next book in the series, which is called Point Blank. So if you are interested, once we get back to school, I know that the library has it. For those of you that do love to read, maybe ask for it for Christmas. I'm not certain. So I'm excited to talk with you guys about it. All right. Bye.